Walk away, human. At second dawn, she becomes ash. Not before she drinks.
Don't touch me. They'll bury you beside me.
Then you'd better make room, Princess.
You have no idea what humans and my people share the same ancestors.
Good. Let's make the family reunion unforgettable.
Mace, behind you.
The execution detail said it would take 40 hours. I figured I'd stick around and find out. The twin sons of Kareth Sol had turned the sky the color of a coal held just before it goes dark, and the salt flat stretching north of the city of Velkarath shimmered with a heat that had opinions about you. Not just hot insisting, the kind of heat that got between your thoughts and shortened them, that pressed at you from above and below simultaneously, and made the air feel like something you had to negotiate with just to breathe. Corporal Mace Dillon had done 2 tours in the Kunar Valley and 1 extraction in the Namib Basin, and he had strong opinions about heat, and his opinion about the heat of Kareth Sol was that it was different. Not hotter, necessarily, more serious, like the planet knew you were standing on it and had not yet decided whether to allow the arrangement. He was thinking about that when the transport stopped, which was how he thought of it, because broke down implied a malfunction, and what had actually happened was that the guard called Veldath, whose name Mace had learned from 4 days of listening to routine shift change conversations through a wall, had looked at the single illuminated panel on the transport cabin's forward surface, tapped it twice, looked at it again with an expression somewhere between boredom and mild inconvenience, and then announced in the clipped declarative register of Cathari that they would walk. Walk, Mace said to confirm. Walk, Veldath said, and gestured with a weapon that looked like a flute that had made some bad decisions. There were roughly 3 kilometers between the broken-down transport and the destination his implant had rendered as something in the range of redistribution facility, specimen storage, secondary classification holding. He had been in primary classification holding for 6 days. He was not certain if secondary was a promotion. The Cathari holding facilities were clean, and they fed you on a schedule, and no one hurt you, which placed them above several detention facilities Mace had direct experience with on Earth. But no one spoke to you either, and the silence had the quality of something being administered, rather than something natural. And after 6 days of it, the walk across the salt flat felt almost like a gift. He walked. His wrists were locked in polymer restraints that were cool to the touch and gave nothing. He tested them anyway, because you tested things. The 2 guards flanked him at the standard Cathari, spacing close enough to respond quickly, far enough apart that they couldn't both be taken by a single move. They did this automatically, without discussion, and he'd spent 4 days noting that their threat modeling was good. They just hadn't modeled the right threats. The 12 people who had come to Kareth Sol with him were dead. He didn't know the details. On the 3rd day, he'd heard distant sounds through the holding facility wall, sounds with a certain quality of finality, and then nothing. And when he'd asked questions, the guards had looked at him with the particular blankness of beings who had decided a question was not worth acknowledging. He held their names in his memory like cargo he couldn't put down. Dr. Chen, Ambassador Reyes, Sergeant Park, who had 3 kids and a strong opinion about playoff seeding, Decker, who was 8 weeks from retirement. Torres had been in a separate holding sector, and whether Torres was still alive was a question he carried like a stone in his chest, and he carried it the same way. He carried everything that might break him carefully, without looking at it directly, 1 step at a time. He smelled something. It reached him before they came around the sandstone formation, carried on the wind off the flat. He processed it the way you process smells, which is faster than thought, and further back in the brain the signal arrives. The body decides how to feel about it, and only after both of those things happen does the conscious mind get to weigh in. What his body decided was familiar. Not pleasant or unpleasant, not alien, just this is something you know. He didn't know it. He had never smelled it before. It was warm and faintly mineral, with an undertone of something green and living that had no business existing in the middle of a salt desert, and it hit him the way a childhood home hits you when you stand in the driveway after 20 years, not the memory itself, just the shape of where one used to be. Then they came around the sandstone, and he saw the ceremony. 41 officials stood in a near-perfect circle, 30 meters across, in the orange sand. The boundary markers were low posts, matte gray, and he could feel the low-frequency vibration they produced in his back, molars Not a physical barrier, he could tell, but a field of some kind, probably thermal or electromagnetic. The officials wore formal robing in deep gray, with gold edging that caught the amber light and threw it back with the kind of deliberateness that required professional assistance to achieve. They faced inward. None of them spoke. The silence had the specific quality of silence that has been prepared, that has been built up over time rather than arrived at. In the center of the circle, the sand had been excavated and filled back in around a living body with a precision that spoke of practice. What remained above ground was a head, a neck, and the upper ridges of 2 shoulders. The figure faced upward, toward the twin suns, eyes closed, features composed into an expression Mace would have read as controlled pain on a human face, and that his translation implant flagged as outside its confidence range for Cathari emotional mapping. The formal head covering that ranked Cathari wore in every recorded interaction he'd reviewed during the transit out here had been removed. The exposed skull was covered in fine iridescent scales that the angled light turned to copper, and then to gold, and then, as the wind shifted, to something darker. His implant caught fragments of the ambient speech and assembled them. Sun burial. Duration 40 hours. Judgment complete at dawn 2nd. Condemned, Zaravel. Velnareth. Charge heresy against covenant. Sentence, standard. Witnesses, 41 sovereign observers, standard complement. 40 hours. The twin suns ran on a cycle of roughly 22 hours each. Dawn 2nd was the moment both cleared the horizon simultaneously, which happened every 40.3 hours on Kareth Sol. He had read that in the mission briefing. The briefing had contained a great deal of information that had become relevant faster than anticipated. He stood at the edge of the marker posts and watched. The condemned woman's breathing was visible in the slight movement of her exposed shoulders. In, count out. In, count out. The rhythm of someone who knew precisely how long they were going to be here and was managing their resources accordingly. The sand inside the circle was a different consistency from the salt flat, more orange, more processed, designed to absorb and hold heat and release it slowly upward. Whoever had built this ceremony had thought carefully about it. The engineering was meticulous and specific, and the fact that someone had been that careful made it worse in a way that was hard to name exactly. Mace took 3 steps forward across the line of posts. The vibration didn't intensify. The field was a marker, not a barrier, a social enforcement mechanism. You weren't supposed to cross it because crossing it was not what was done, and in most situations, that was enough. He sat down in the sand about 2 meters to the woman's left, crossed his legs as well as the polymer restraints allowed, and looked at the ring of officials. The silence held for 4 seconds. He counted. Then it started. The nearest official turned, and the one beside him turned, and Veldath said something sharp that his implant rendered as zone violation. Specimen, remove. Now carrying a register marker that indicated something stronger than polite instruction. The second guard took 3 quick steps to Mace's side, wrapped both hands around his upper arm, and pulled. Mace leaned into the pull. He was 6'1" and 220, and he'd kept the muscle through 6 days of detention, the way you keep anything you might need, and his boots pressed flat against the engineered sand and did not move. The guard adjusted grip, found a different angle, tried again. Same result. Veldath came around from the other side, and for a moment, they were both pulling, and Mace was sitting at a slight angle that was probably uncomfortable for everyone involved and solving nothing. Specimen, Veldath said. In the register, Mace thought of as the imperative mode the grammatical structure Cathari used for orders given to things expected to comply. Not beings being asked, things being directed. Stand. No thank you, Mace said. His reverse translation matrix processed this and flagged it low confidence, somewhere around 50%. He had no idea what Veldath actually heard, but the guard stopped pulling and looked at him with the expression. Mace was starting to recognize, as genuine cognitive recategorization, the face you make when a variable has done something outside the parameters of your model. Specimen, this zone is minus. Yeah, Mace said. I got that. He looked at the woman buried in the sand. Her eyes were still closed. The rising heat of the morning pressed down on the back of his neck with growing personal interest. Why are you sitting here? Her voice was roughened by heat and the early stages of dehydration, but the words were clean, American English. Not translated, the implant behind his ear was silent. She was speaking his language directly, with the careful formality of someone who had learned it from text more than from conversation, the accent of recordings rather than rooms. "You speak English," he said, and immediately recognized that as one of the less useful observations he had ever made out loud. "I studied your species for 11 years, she said. The amber eyes, the specific shade of old honey held up to light, were open now, and they were looking at him the way you look at something unexpected, that might be either a problem or a solution, and you have not yet determined which. Galactic Council Diplomatic Communications have used a form of English since first contact.
I requested the full language files from the Sovereignty archives. I had been preparing an argument."
A careful breath conserving, in your species' defense, in front of the Sovereignty Council. He took a moment with that. In my species' defense. The Council was deliberating on whether to reclassify humanity from Category 7 uncontrolled biological hazard to Category 4, sapient developing species with observer status. Her breathing was controlled, meticulous. The practical difference between those two classifications is substantial, I noticed. He thought about the sounds he'd heard on the third day and kept his voice flat. The amber eyes held his gaze without flinching. "Why are you sitting here?" "Because there was no one else," he said. She was quiet for a moment. The officials were conducting a murmured consultation that his implant caught in fragments. Protocol, unclear. Escalate to senior witness. Civilian boundary violation. Specimen non-compliance. Unclear. Precedent. Nobody had moved against him physically again yet, which was its own information. "You don't know who I am," she said. "No. You don't know what they're executing me for. Not yet. And you sat down anyway." "Yeah." She studied him with the quality of attention you give to something that doesn't fit the model you've been using. Not hostility, not hope. Analysis. "I'm Corporal Mace Dillon," he said, United States Marine Corps, sole survivor of Earth's first formal diplomatic escort. Currently being classified as specimen, which I understand is different from prisoner in ways I haven't fully mapped out yet. I know who you are. The roughness in her voice was getting more pronounced as the sun climbed. You were given a bilateral dilemma assessment on your second day in holding. Every member of your party was. The assessment measures self-preservation weighting against arbitrary social obligation. The expected range for sapient beings is 60 to 85. Above 90 typically indicates calculation error or instrument malfunction. He already knew where this was going from something he'd overheard on day 4, but he let her get there. "What did I score?" 41. Your case was flagged for retesting. The retests produced 41, 38, and 44. The assessment lead concluded instrument malfunction and scheduled you for extended behavioral assessment. Her voice was a fraction quieter than it had been 30 seconds ago, managing moisture, and she pressed on without pausing for it. "That scheduling discrepancy is why you are still alive when your party is not." He sat with that for a moment. 41. Below the range for standard self-preservation weighting. The 11 people who had scored within the expected range were gone. And he was here because he'd answered a hypothetical scenario in a way a machine had decided was broken. He looked at the officials, who were still consulting. He had time, but not unlimited time. "What's your name?" he said. "Zara Zarval Velnareth, second of the Cathari Royal House, Sovereignty Council Observer, licensed Covenant Scholar." A pause. The specific pause of someone deciding something. The last designation is the relevant one. What's a Covenant Scholar? The amber eyes tracked him steadily. The heat inside the marker circle was already several degrees above the air. Outside it, he could see the shimmer. Over the next 20 hours, as both suns reached zenith together, for the first time in the cycle, it was going to become something else entirely. And she'd been here since before he arrived. She'd been managing this since before he arrived. "The Covenant archives are the foundational records of the galactic sovereignty," Zaravel said. "Its history, its treaties, its origins, the biological and legal framework establishing the classification of every known species, including the rationale for each classification. Covenant scholars are the only beings authorized to access the full archive text," she breathed carefully. "I am? I was one of 14 currently licensed." "Was," he said. "Past tense, yes. You found something." Something moved across her face, very fast, very controlled. Not the something he might have expected, not grief, not fear. Something that looked more like the expression of someone who has been carrying a very heavy thing for a very long time and has finally been asked precisely and correctly what it is. Ask me, she said, why I'm being executed. Corporal Dillon. He checked the ring of officials. The consultation was still ongoing. He looked back at her. The wind shifted again, and that familiar, not familiar smell came with it, and the part of his brain that handled the smell filed it again under familiar, and still couldn't tell him why. Why are they executing you? He asked. Because, Zaravel said, her voice roughened but her eyes absolutely steady. I found something that the most powerful faction in the galactic sovereignty needs to remain unfound. And because I have a photographic memory, and I have read every word of what I found, the only way to destroy the information is to destroy me. She held his gaze with the specific gravity of someone handing over something that cannot be handed back. I am the archive, Corporal. I am all that remains of it. Mace looked at the officials in their formal robing, standing in their prepared circle in the prepared sand under the insisting suns, and thought about the engineering of a ceremony that was not about punishment at all. That was about deletion. What did you find? He said. She opened her mouth to answer. Then Veldeth made a decision, stepped forward, wrapped a hand around Mace's upper arm with a grip that communicated finality, and said, Specimen, last opportunity, stand now. Mace pressed his boots into the sand. No, he said. Thank you. 8 hours into the 40, the second sun had climbed to a position that meant both of them were working at once, and the heat inside the marker circle had become something that had weight. Mace noticed it in the quality of the light. First, the way the air above the orange sand rippled, in a way that made the world look slightly unreal. Edges softened, distances unreliable. He'd been sitting in the same position for 8 hours with one 45-minute interruption when Far Guards had tried to move him, and, failing that, had attempted to move him by using a longer lever and more bodies, which had worked about as well as the first approach. He had a bruise along his left ribs from that one. He had decided not to think about what that implied about what was coming next. He had improvised shade for Zaravel, using his jacket and a stick of sandstone he'd found near the marker post. The angle was wrong and the coverage was partial, but it dropped the direct sunlight off her face and neck, and she had looked at it for a moment without saying anything, and then said, thank you, in English, with a precision that made him think she'd thought about whether to say it. She had told him things in the hours since. Not the full truth he understood without needing it, explained that trust was a currency that required investment before it would spend, and what she was doing was making deposits. The Covenant Archives. The founding records of the galactic sovereignty, not the public version that was available to any diplomat with proper clearance, but the foundational text, the version underneath the version, the records that predated the current sovereignty by 30,000 years, and that formed the actual legal and biological basis for everything built on top of them. She had been authorized to access them because her research proposal had been reviewed and approved by a panel of 7 senior archivists who had assumed she was looking at trade treaty precedent. She had been looking at something else. She had found it on the 43rd day of her archive access, in a section of the biological records that had been encrypted with a cipher she had broken slowly, carefully, over 11 nights, because she had not been able to stop wondering why a section of foundational biological records was encrypted at all. It's not supposed to be encrypted, she said. It was the middle of the morning, and she was managing her water loss with precision, taking in no more than 1 shallow breath per 8 seconds, which Mace had been timing unconsciously and which was working out to a rate of water loss that, by his rough calculations, gave her somewhere between 6 and 10 more hours of coherent conversation. Covenant archives are designated as permanent unencrypted public record under Sovereignty Charter. The encryption itself is a violation, so whoever encrypted it knew it was a violation, Mace said. They encrypted it 80,000 years ago, she said, when there was no one left with authority to object. The sound she made on the word 80 was not quite pain, but it was in the same zip code, and she controlled it quickly. He cataloged that. Her pain responses were not what he would have expected from a non-human organism. They had a quality that he recognized, a specific relationship between stimulus and expression that mapped to human physiology in a way he couldn't account for. He had been around enough injured people in enough varying circumstances to know that pain sounds different across the human physiological spectrum, different enough that you could sometimes tell from a groan how bad it was, what kind of hurt it was, where in the body it was coming from. Zaravel's controlled sounds of pain, the ones she let through when the heat spiked or when she shifted slightly to redistribute pressure, sounded like a human being's controlled sounds of pain. Not similar, not analogous. The same. He noted it and kept it to himself. Around the 9th hour, the senior witness arrived. He came from the direction of the city in a vehicle that did not break down, flanked by 8 guards in full formal ceremonial armor that must have been miserable in the heat and that they wore without visible complaint. The vehicle stopped outside the marker circle, and he stepped out. He was tall for a Cathari, which meant he was roughly Mace's height, with the distinctive bone structure of the high-ranking caste, slightly elongated jaw, wider set eyes, scales that were a deep purple gray rather than the copper bronze of the guards. He wore formal archival robing, which was different from the witness robing. The 41 officials wore darker, with a specific pattern of gold that Mace's implant tagged as Office of the High Archivist. Mace's implant also flagged a name, Selthun, High Archivist of the Covenant, first of the Architect Faculty, senior member of the Sovereignty Founding Council. Selthun walked to the marker post nearest Mace, stood there for a moment, looking at him with eyes that were the color of deep water in a place where no light reached, and then spoke in Kithari at a pace and register his implant could follow clearly. "You are the human specimen designated Dillon," Selthun said. "Corporal Mace Dillon," Mace said, "United States Marine Corps. You are a Category 7 biological entity in violation of 3 sovereign protocols and currently impeding a lawful judicial proceeding." Selthun's voice had the texture of someone's who had been in authority long enough that authority had become structural rather than performed, not the voice of someone telling you he had power, but the voice of someone who had forgotten that power required telling. "You will stand, move to the designated holding area, and your cooperation will be noted in the proceeding record. And if I don't cooperate?" A pause. Not the pause of someone uncertain, the pause of someone deciding which of several available answers to use. "Your specimen status can be reclassified. Category 7 biological entities that demonstrate active hostility to sovereign proceedings may be reclassified to Category 8. His implant didn't have a clean rendering for Category 8. The fragments it caught suggested something in the range of non-viable specimen, terminal status. "Can I ask you something?" Mace said. Selthun looked at him the way you look at furniture that has raised an objection. "You may make a statement." "Why are you here?" Mace said. "The High Archivist of the Covenant. At a sun burial execution. On a desert planet that is, if I read the transit maps right, roughly 600 light-years from the sovereignty capital." He kept his voice conversational, because conversational was harder to argue with than anything else. "There are 41 witnesses and 11 guards, and 2 guards already assigned to me. You don't need to be here. So why are you here?" Selthun looked at him for a moment that lasted exactly 1 second longer than it should have, given that Mace was a specimen, and the question was not worth engaging with. Then he said, "Remove this entity from the ceremonial boundary. Reclassify to preliminary Category 8 and hold for assessment." The 8 ceremonial guards moved. Mace got his feet under him before they arrived, which saved his ribs. They went for a standing carry rather than a drag. He had his weight distributed wrong for what they were trying to do and managed to buy 3 more seconds before the combined leverage of 4 of them got him upright. And in those 3 seconds, Zaravel said something in a dialect his implant flagged as Archaic Cathari, confidence 31%, and he caught 3 words out of the stream: human, behind, second. He filed it. The guards walked him out of the marker circle. Selthun was already moving back toward his vehicle. Transaction completed. The 41 witnesses had returned their attention to the center of the circle. Mace let himself be walked and counted the guards and watched where Selthun's vehicle was parking relative to the marker posts and waited. At the edge of the designated holding area, a flat rectangle of shade from a natural rock outcropping, bounded by 2 portable marker posts, 2 of the 4 guards stopped. The other 2 took up positions behind him. He sat down in the shade and looked at the ceremony through the gap in the posts, where Zaravel was visible from this angle as a copper-scaled head against orange sand, and he thought about the word second and what it might mean in Archaic Cathari, and what might happen behind him at what time. His implant could not tell him. 31% was not a useful confidence threshold, but something in the specific rhythm and urgency of the fragment suggested it had been information, not rhetoric. At the 47th minute of holding, Veldath came to collect him for relocation to a secondary holding facility, which meant another walk, which meant another angle on the ceremony. And as Veldath was explaining this in the clipped declarative, Mace said, "The guard coming up on your left side. What is that in his hand?" Veldath turned. It was the correct response. Any trained security person turns to verify when you flag an unexpected variable behind them. There was nothing notable in the guard's left hand, a standard weapon, properly holstered. But the turn had taken Veldath's eyes off Mace for 1.8 seconds, and the guard behind Mace had instinctively mirrored the look. And in that window, Mace had moved sideways along the rock face, to a position where neither guard had a clean angle, and the rock itself was between him and Selton's vehicle line of sight. He stopped there, back against sandstone, and looked at Veldath. Veldath looked at him, then at the guard, then back at Mace. That was, Veldath said, in what his implant rendered as a contemplative register, not a standard specimen behavior. No, Mace agreed. You anticipated the secondary approach. Someone warned me. Veldath was quiet for a moment. Behind them, at a distance, Selton had emerged from his vehicle with a new expression on his face, and Mace watched it from the corner of his eye. It was not the expression of anger. It was not the expression of annoyance at a disrupted operational sequence. It was a sharper thing, a thing that sat lower in the face and pulled at the muscles around the eyes, in a way that had less to do with inconvenience and more to do with fear, the specific quality of fear that arises not when a situation is dangerous, but when a situation has done something that the model said was impossible. Mace noted it, filed it. He did not look at Selton directly. Veldath ultimately put him back in the holding area rather than relocating him, because the secondary approach team was gone, and the standard protocol for relocation required a full complement, and whatever calculation Veldath ran, it produced a result that looked like, table this problem for now. The secondary approach was not attempted again that day. 3 hours later, when the guards had settled into the rhythm of watching him without engaging, Mace got up, walked back across the marker post boundary, and sat down next to Zaravel. The guards looked at each other. Then at Selton's vehicle, which was still parked, but whose occupant had not emerged in 2 hours. No one moved to remove him. Zaravel's eyes opened when his shadow fell across the edge of her peripheral vision. She looked at him with something that would have taken him much longer to name if he hadn't been trained to read human faces. Because it was a thing he only ever saw in human faces, and he was still in the process of understanding that it meant the same thing here. You came back, she said. Yeah. He sat down, tested the shade angle from the stick he'd repositioned, and adjusted it 2 degrees. What does the word second mean in archaic Cathari? The noun or the verb? Not the number. She was quiet for a moment. The verb form means to be positioned behind a primary threat with concealed intent.
It is a military term. It predates the sovereignty by approximately 12,000 years.
Old term, he said. Very old. Her voice had more roughness in it now, the hours accumulating, but her eyes were sharp as ever. Before they moved me. Archaic, register, my implant only caught fragments. He looked at her. You were warning me. I did not know your implant would catch an archaic register. Neither did I, honestly. 31% confidence isn't usually actionable. He paused. I acted on it anyway. She looked at him for a long time, long enough that the quality of looking changed from assessment to something that had more depth in it. Why? He thought about it genuinely, because he owed her a genuine answer. Because you tried, he said. In a situation where trying something was a risk, and not trying wasn't making things any better. You tried something. That's a reason. I could have been mistaken. You could have been. I could have made it worse. He looked at the sky, where both suns were now at angles that meant the heat had another 4 hours to climb before it peaked. We won't know unless we try and see what happens. That's how all the good problems get solved. She was quiet again. The wind moved across the flat and brought the smell again, the familiar, not familiar smell, and he noticed it again and still could not name it. Tell me more, he said. About what you found. Zaravel's breathing steadied to its careful rhythm. When she spoke again, her voice was lower, conserving, but the precision was intact. The Covenant archives contain the founding biological records of every species in the sovereignty, she said. Classification, assessment, developmental trajectory, threat projection. Every species with sovereignty membership is in those records. Every client species, every protected species, every extinct species whose existence was documented before extinction. A pause, and every species classified as Category 7 or below. Species like humans. Yes. The amber eyes were fixed somewhere past him, on the memory of words read in a room she would not see again. I was reviewing the oldest biological records from the founding period, 80,000 years ago, because my research concerned the original methodology used to classify first contact species. I wanted to understand the basis on which the founding council made their initial assessments. Her voice carried the careful flatness of someone describing something that had changed them, and who was being precise about the description rather than dramatic about the change. In the encrypted section, I found a set of records that should not exist under Sovereignty Charter. Records of a deliberate intervention. A directed biological event. What kind of intervention? She looked at him then. The amber eyes had something in them that he would have called, on a human face, the specific weight of a truth that is too large to carry casually. The kind, Zaravel said, that requires you to understand something first. About what you are. About what we are. She stopped. A sound at the edge of controlled, pulled back. But not today. Today I need you to understand only this. What I found is why I am here, and the reason they need me to die before I tell anyone is that if I do tell someone, if the information leaves my memory and reaches even one independent record, everything built on that encrypted section collapses. Everything meaning what? Everything meaning, she said, the galactic sovereignty, the classification system, the legal framework for every treaty, every membership, every protection and exclusion in the known galaxy, every justification for every war conducted under sovereignty sanction. A breath, including the current status of your species. Mace sat with that. The insisting heat pushed down on everything, and the marker posts hummed, and the 41 witnesses stood in their circle, and Selton's vehicle sat at the perimeter, like a stone someone had left with intention. How long is your photographic memory reliable? He asked. Indefinitely, she said. It is why I was admitted to the Covenant Scholar Program. Every word I have read in the archives is precisely recoverable at any time. She looked at him steadily. It is also why there is no copy. I destroyed my research notes when I understood what I had found and what would happen if those notes were found first. The information exists only in my memory, and when my memory is gone, the information is gone, May said. Yes. He looked at the engineered sand. He looked at the insisting sky. He looked at the woman whose memory contained the most dangerous truth in the galaxy, buried to her neck in a desert designed to make things stop working. Okay, he said. Okay, she repeated, as if testing the word's weight. I'm going to need a few things, he said, and some time to think. Do you have any water? For the first time since he had sat down beside her 9 hours ago, Zaravel almost smiled. It was a fractional thing, barely there, pulled back before it completed. But he caught it. You are, she said, a very unusual specimen. I'll take that as a no on the water, May said. He started digging at the 16th hour, not with a plan. That was the honest accounting of it. He did not start digging because he had worked out an escape route, or because he had assessed the guard rotation and found a pattern worth exploiting, or because some tactical picture had resolved itself into a clear sequence of moves. He started digging because the sun had been at its highest for 2 hours, and the heat inside the marker circle had become the kind of thing that made rational deliberation feel like a luxury, and because Zaravel's breathing had changed in the last 40 minutes, from the careful, controlled rhythm to something shallower and less regular, and because watching change without doing anything about it had stopped being possible. The sand was compacted around her body, packed deliberately, designed to hold, and his hands were still in the polymer restraints, which meant the digging went slowly. He used the edge of the restraint itself as a scraper and his cupped palms as shovels, and moved roughly half a liter of sand per minute, which was not fast enough, but was faster than zero. The guards watched him for a while, and then a senior guard came over and told him, in language his implant had no trouble with, that digging was prohibited under ceremony protocols. Mace kept digging. The guard told him again. Mace kept digging. The guard looked at the others, and there was a conversation that produced no consensus fast enough to matter. You don't have to do this, Zaravel said. Her voice was rough now, in a way that was no longer just dehydration. The beginnings of heat exhaustion were in it, the slight dissociation of someone whose body had been deciding for hours which functions were optional. The odds of a successful. I'm not calculating odds right now, Mace said. You should be. I know. He moved another double handful of sand. Hand me that stone. I don't have hands available at the moment.
Right.
He found the flat stone himself, near the edge of the cleared area, and it was better than his palm edges for moving compacted material. Tell me more about the archives. Keep talking. Why? Because it keeps you focused, and focused is better than not focused, and because I want to know. He worked the stone along the packed edge, the deliberate intervention, the biological event. What was it? The amber eyes tracked him. She was deciding something. Then she said, 200,000 years ago, a stellar event, an asymmetrical nova in a binary system, fragmented and scattered the population of a spacefaring species across several adjacent star systems. The species had been developing for approximately 300,000 years. They had achieved interstellar travel, but not galactic-scale civilization. The stellar event separated two major population centers permanently. She paused for breath. Those two populations evolved in isolation for the next 120,000 years. Mace dug and listened. 80,000 years ago, the architects, the founding council of what would become the galactic sovereignty, made contact with both populations separately. Within a span of 4,000 years, she was working to keep her voice level and managing it, though the effort was visible. Population A was more technologically developed. They had rebuilt from the stellar event faster. The architects assessed them as potential founding partners and began the integration process. Population A is what the sovereignty now calls the Keth Ari. May stopped digging, then started again. And Population B, he said. Population B was assessed as less advanced. They were rebuilding more slowly. The stellar event had cost them more. The architects made a determination, a sound in her throat that was controlled before it became anything. They reclassified Population B as a Category 7 biological hazard, placed their homeworld under a quarantine designation, and expunged all record of the original shared ancestry from the founding documents. They then encrypted the evidence and buried it in a section of the archives that should, by their calculations, never be accessed without the cipher that only the architects possessed. The stone scraped against something hard. He worked around it. The compacted sand was coming up in sections now, slower than he wanted, but coming. They didn't know about your memory, he said. No, her voice was quieter. They did not know that a Covenant scholar 270 generations later would notice an encryption in a document that should have no encryption and be stubborn enough to spend 11 nights breaking it. What is Population B's homeworld called, he said, though he already knew. In the original architect records, Zaravel said, it is designated Aerith. The population itself is recorded under their own name for their species. She held his gaze. Homo sapiens. He kept digging. The stone moved. Another section came up. From the direction of the nearest guard station, maybe 80 meters away, there was a sound. Not an alarm, not a weapon, charging. A sound that had a more specific quality than either of those, a sound that Mace's body categorized, at a level below conscious thought, as someone doing something they need to be quiet about. He stopped digging, looked at the station, looked back at the sand, kept digging. From his peripheral vision, he counted the guards. 11 official ceremony guards, plus what remained of his personal detail. But the sound had come from outside the perimeter, not inside it, and it had the specific quality of movement over rough ground by someone who knew how to move over rough ground, but was moving faster than comfort allowed. Dylan. The voice was low, American English, and came from behind a sandstone formation 3 meters beyond the southern marker posts. He kept his face pointed at the sand and his expression pointed at neutral. Torres, he said, very quietly. Yeah, a pause. Dylan, what in the absolute hell are you doing? Digging someone out. I can see that. Another pause, longer. Is that working? Slowly.
Okay. Leah Torres had been a sergeant with 8 years in, 4 deployments, and a philosophy degree, she mentioned, at irregular intervals to maximum inconvenient effect.
She was also evidently alive. I have your emergency transmitter. Found it on a guard who was carrying it on the outside of his belt, which is the kind of security posture you make when you don't think the enemy has any reach left. A pause. Do we have any reach left? Working on it, May said. Okay. He could hear the specific calibration in her voice, the sound of someone running fast math on available information. and forcing the result into operational shape. I'm coming in from the south. The guard rotation pattern has a 40-second gap between the third and fourth position, and it happens every 9 minutes. I'm going to be inside the marker boundary on the next cycle. When I get there, I need you to have already started a significant problem somewhere in the northern quadrant. Define significant. Something that makes 4 guards go north at the same time. Mace looked at the 41 witnesses. They had been standing for 16 hours. He looked at Selton's vehicle. He looked at the area between the vehicle and the northern posts. He looked at the sky. Then he said, "Give me 6 minutes." 6 minutes, Torres confirmed and was quiet. Mace worked the stone for another 4 minutes, widening the cleared area around Zaravil's upper body, freeing her shoulders, giving her room to move if she could. She was watching him throughout with those amber eyes that had been steady for 16 hours and were now slightly glassy. At the edges not gone but being used hard. Then, he stood up, walked to the northern quadrant of the marker circle, and knocked over 2 of the posts. The field they projected died immediately, which was not a problem for him. It was, however, a significant protocol violation, and the 6 guards closest to the north perimeter moved toward it with the trained urgency of beings whose job description included maintaining the ceremonial boundary. The ceremony supervisor, a senior witness on the eastern position, produced a tone from a device on his wrist that brought 4 more. That was 10. 2 remained on the south side. Attention pulled north. Torres came through the southern gap at a low sprint, cleared the 2 remaining guards' sightlines by a margin that Mace estimated at approximately 2 meters, and was beside him before anyone in the northern cluster had fully processed what had come in behind them. She was favoring her left arm. There was dried blood on her right collar that was not hers, by the angle of it, and fresh blood on her left sleeve that probably was. She looked at Zaravil in the sand, looked at Mace, looked at the digging progress. "We've got maybe 4 minutes," she said, and dropped to her knees and started digging with both hands. They worked. The sand was compacted deep, but the top layer, which Mace had already broken, came up faster in volume when 2 people were moving it. Torres found a second flat stone without being told to look for one and used it correctly, which was just Torres. Zaravil worked too. Once her arms were free slowly, heat exhausted, but adding what she had. 3 minutes and change produced a hole deep enough to see that her legs were intact. 4 minutes and 30 seconds produced enough clearance that she could move them. 5 minutes in, she stood up. It was not a triumphant stand. It was the stand of someone whose body had been in one position for 16 hours in extreme heat, which is the stand of someone who has to decide whether standing is actually possible and then force it to be. She got upright. Her legs did not cooperate initially. Mace caught her on the left side. Torres caught her on the right, and the 3 of them stood there for exactly the amount of time they could afford to stand there, which was 3 seconds. "Can you walk?" Torres said. "Yes," Zaravil said, and then proved it. They went south, through the now gap in the marker posts, into the open desert beyond. Behind them, the ceremony erupted from the controlled ritual stillness. It had maintained for 16 hours into something considerably louder, and Selton's vehicle started, and at least 6 voices, at various distances, were saying things that Mace's implant caught as variations on pursue, intercept, and terminate. But the desert south of the ceremony site was not flat. It was broken sandstone formations and salt ridges and dried channel beds, terrain that favored the people who had been told to walk through it rather than the people who were loading into vehicles to chase someone through it. Mace took the route east, where the formations were bigger and closer together. Torres ran well despite the left arm. Zaravil ran badly, the heat exhaustion, and the hours in the sand had used most of her reserves, but she ran, and she did not ask to stop, and when she stumbled on a channel, Edge Mace caught her without breaking stride, and she said thank you in English, with the same precision she'd used the first time, and kept moving. 2 vehicle sounds, far enough behind to be a gap but not a large gap. 30 seconds, maybe 40. He picked a channel bed that went northeast, wider at the entrance than at the interior, which meant the vehicles would not follow it, and anyone on foot would have to slow down to navigate it. He moved them through it at pace, Zaravil between him and Torres, and as they moved she talked because he had asked her to keep talking, and she apparently took instructions seriously. "The DNA concordance," she said. breathing hard but articulate a function of how her mind worked. He was beginning to understand that precision did not fully yield to physical extremity. Between Cathari and your species, I obtained samples from the genetic material your mission provided during the intake assessments. Standard procedure biological sampling is part of the Category 7 intake protocol. A rough breath. I ran my own analysis before I was arrested. The concordance is 98.7%. 98.7, Torres said from his right. Repeat that number for me. 98.7%, Zaravel said. Chimpanzee and human genomes on your world are 98.7% concordant. The Cathari and human genomes are 98.7% concordant, with divergence patterns consistent not with parallel evolution, but with a single shared ancestry and 120,000 years of isolated development. Torres looked at Mace across Zaravel. Mace kept moving. The encrypted records confirmed this, Zaravel continued. The channel was narrowing, forcing them single file, and she dropped behind him but kept talking. The architect intervention included deliberate selection pressure applied to population A over 4,000 years, environmental management, resource manipulation, what in your literature I believe would be called an uplifting event. The goal was to accelerate population A's technological and social development to sovereignty integration standards while simultaneously ensuring population B remained quarantined long enough to be categorized as permanently inferior. She paused, not for breath, for something else. The architects did not expect population B to develop independently to sapience and spaceflight within 80,000 years. Their models gave your species another 300,000 years, minimum. We were early, Torres said. By a significant margin, Zaravel said. Which is why the current diplomatic crisis exists. Your species was not supposed to reach sovereignty space for another 220,000 years. The quarantine protocols were designed for a much more distant problem. The channel opened into a broader flat, sheltered on three sides by high sandstone walls. The vehicle sounds were further behind now they'd taken a longer route around the channel system. Maybe 90 seconds. Mace stopped them. How are you doing? He said to Zaravel. She took stock of herself in the efficient way she did everything. Functioning, reduced capacity. I need water within the next 4 hours or I will lose higher cognitive functions. She looked at him steadily. Where are we going? North, he said. There's a high point on the survey maps I reviewed during transit prep. 40. Your emergency transmitter, he looked at Torres. What's its range? Torres pulled it from her belt. It was scratched and had a dent in the casing that was new, but the indicator light was green. Standard Earth emergency frequency. Reaches the nearest relay buoy with clear line of sight and at least 200 meters of elevation above the surrounding terrain. She turned it over. At the high point you're talking about, yeah, it'd reach. How far does that get the signal? To the nearest Earth Navy relay, which is sitting at the edge of sovereignty space, about 14 light years out. From there it gets routed to command. Torres looked at him. That's assuming command is listening for Category 7 distress signals from inside sovereignty territory, which officially they're not supposed to be doing, but I'd bet money on it. So if we reach the high point and transmit, Mace said, Earth gets the message. Yes, Torres said. Earth gets whatever we send. He looked at Zaravel. She was watching him with those steady amber eyes. Heat exhausted but precise. The implications were obvious and she knew them. If Earth receives those records, she said, and her voice carried the weight of someone saying something that cannot be unsaid, the sovereignty will have no choice but to treat the transmission as a breach of the quarantine protocol. That has historically meant military response. She held his gaze. Your species does not have a military capable of a response to what the sovereignty can send. We're aware of that problem, Torres said, with the particular dryness of someone for whom awareness of a problem and inability to solve it were not the same thing. The alternative, Mace said, is that the records stay in your memory, and as soon as Selthun gets you back, your memory is no longer operational. Yes, she said. So it's that problem or the other problem. Yes, she said. The vehicle sounds were getting closer again. He looked north, 40 kilometers. Evening in 6 hours, and the desert got cold fast. That was in the briefing too. And cold was better than heat for everyone in their current condition. He looked at Torres's arm and got a reading from the set of her jaw. Functional, manageable, not something that was going to stop her. He looked at Zaravel and saw that she was already deciding, had been in the process deciding for some time now, and that what she was waiting for was not his answer, but her own certainty. "There's a sovereignty relay tower on the high point," she said. She'd been thinking about something. Infrastructure. Communication infrastructure for this sector. "I noticed it in the aerial survey data when I was preparing my advocacy materials." She paused. "If the tower can be accessed, I could broadcast on the Sovereignty Galactic Open Frequency." Mace looked at her and say, "What?" "Everything," she said. "Every word of the Covenant Archives encrypted section. I have it, all of it. I will remember it forever." The amber eyes held something that was steady and clear and very final. A broadcast on Galactic Open Frequency is a sealed public record from the moment transmission begins. It cannot be retracted. It cannot be classified after the fact. Every sovereignty member and observer would receive it. Torres made a sound.
"You're talking about destroying the entire legal framework of the galaxy."
"No," Zaravel said.
"I am talking about correcting the falsified foundation of the legal framework of the galaxy."
What is built on that foundation afterward is a different question for different people and different peoples in a different time. She looked at both of them. "But the falsification ends. That much I can do." The vehicle sounds were 20 seconds behind them. "Walk and talk," Torres said, and they started moving. They put 2 more kilometers between themselves and the pursuit before Zaravel stumbled, genuinely stumbled. Not a near miss, a hard stumble that would have put her down if Mace hadn't been close enough to take her weight. He got her arm over his shoulder and kept moving. She did not tell him to put her down. The sandstone formations grew taller as they went north. The shade they provided was irregular but real. The vehicle sounds fell further. Behind the terrain was winning. In the last amber light before the larger sun descended below the horizon, they found a rock outcropping, wide enough to shelter under, and Torres said, "Here, a few hours, we move at second dark." Mace got Zaravel settled against the rock. She was unconscious within 3 minutes, not dead, breathing steady if shallow, the controlled rhythm replaced by genuine sleep. He checked her pulse the way he'd check anyone's pulse, 2 fingers at the angle of the jaw, and he didn't think about why the location felt natural until after he'd done it. Torres sat beside him, and they were quiet for a while. 98.7%, Torres said finally. "Yeah," Mace said. "So every time we called them alien, yeah." Torres was quiet again. Outside the outcropping, the second sun was going down, and the temperature was dropping at a rate that confirmed the briefing data. In a few hours, it would be genuinely cold. That was better. "Mace," Torres said, "what happens if we get to the high point and we send everything? And Earth gets it, and the sovereignty sends whatever they send?" He looked at the unconscious woman who had spent 16 hours in the sun managing her water consumption and talking precisely about the most important truth in the galaxy. "I don't know," he said, "but you're going to do it." He thought about a dilemma assessment. 41, 38, 44. "Let's see what happens," he said. An hour before second dark, Zaravel woke up. She came back to consciousness with the specific quality of someone who has strong habits of mind quickly, without the gradual emergence Mace usually saw in field conditions, more like a switch being thrown than a dial being turned. She was sitting up and taking stock before he had registered that her breathing had changed. "Water," Torres said, and handed her a half-empty emergency packet she'd found in a pouch on one of the guards during their exit. It was the terrestrial-type Earth issue from the diplomatic mission supplies, which meant it had been confiscated, and the guard had been carrying it for reasons that were now irrelevant. Zaravel took it, drank, not greedily measured, calibrated. Then she looked at both of them. "How far to the high point?" 28 kilometers, Torres said. "Rough terrain. But the worst of the vehicle access breaks down about 5 kilometers south of here. On foot, we've got the better approach route." "How long?" 6 hours at the pace you can manage, 4 at a run. The pursuit team will have a forward position established at the high point," Zaravel said. "Selthan will have anticipated the relay tower." "Yeah," Mace said. "He will." The 3 of them sat with that for a moment. "Then we need something," Torres said, "that he can't anticipate." She looked at Mace. "Tell me what you've got." "What I've got," Mace said, "is a transmitter and a broadcast window. Both of those things need us to be at the top of the high point for at least 3 minutes. He looked at Zaravel. "What does Sovereignty Protocol require when a member of the Royal House initiates a public galactic broadcast?" She was quiet for 2 seconds. Then, a formal response opportunity. Any member of the founding royal houses has the right to 3 minutes of uninterrupted galactic broadcast before any sovereignty security action can be executed in a public record context. The protocol predates the current sovereignty. It is charter level. It cannot be suspended by any single archivist or council member. She paused. Selthun cannot give a kill order while I am broadcasting on galactic open frequency. Not legally. Not without creating a charter violation that would itself be a galactic record event. So he'd have to wait 3 minutes, Torres said. He would have to wait, Zaravel said. And in 3 minutes, Mace said, you can read how much of the archives. Her eyes moved to a specific focus he was starting to recognize as the look of someone accessing a photographic memory, directly, not remembering but reading, the way you read off a page. The encrypted section in full, she said. It is approximately 9,000 words. I read at a pace of approximately 4,200 words per minute. I can complete the full text in 2 minutes, 6 seconds. That gives us 54 seconds of margin, Torres said. During which, Mace said, I will be transmitting the same content on the Earth's emergency frequency. A simultaneous transmission, Zaravel said. Galactic Open Record and Earth Military Relay. Both sealed simultaneously. Both sealed simultaneously, Mace confirmed. Torres looked at the emergency transmitter. Then at Mace. You know what happens after we transmit. We've been over that. I know we've been over it. I'm saying it out loud because it deserves to be said out loud. Torres met his eyes. If Earth gets those records, they can't unknow them. Command won't sit on it. They'll go to the Sovereignty Council. And when they go to the Sovereignty Council with proof that humanity is a Cathari variant species that was illegally quarantined, one of two things happens. Either the Sovereignty Council capitulates, which means dismantling 80,000 years of legal structure, or they don't capitulate, and they send whatever they send to enforce the quarantine. Torres paused. And Earth sends what it has, which is not nothing, but it's also not a match for what they have. You're saying it starts a war, Mace said. I'm saying it starts a war, Torres confirmed.
The silence that followed was the kind that had actual weight.
Zaravel broke it. May I say something? She looked at Torres, then Mace. Her voice had none of the roughness of the desert. Now it had been replaced by something clean and deliberate. I have spent 11 years preparing an argument to present to the Sovereignty Council. I had 300 pages of reasoning. I had legal precedent, biological research, 11 years of evidence that humanity was sapient, was communicative, was not a hazard but a potential partner. She paused. They arrested me before my presentation date. They arrested me because Selthun had access to my research calendar. He saw the argument coming and moved first. Her amber eyes moved between both of them. I do not believe they will capitulate. Selthun and the Architect faction have built their authority on 80,000 years of this specific truth staying buried. They cannot afford to capitulate. What they will do is attempt containment. She stopped. But I believe that what I found is also true. And I believe that truth, given the opportunity to spread, cannot be fully contained. Not once it has been in the galactic record. Not once Earth has received it and made its own decisions about what to do with it. She looked at Mace. I believe what you believe, I think. That you try, and you see what happens. Torres made a sound that was not quite a laugh. The two of you, she said. Is that a no? Mace said. That's a no on the asking for permission, Torres said. She stood up, put the emergency transmitter in her left-hand pocket, which meant the arm with less functionality, which meant she was keeping her right hand free. It is absolutely not a no on the doing. She looked north, where the high point was a darker shape against a dark sky. Okay, here's what I think. You're going to need a clear runway to the relay tower, because if Selthun has a forward position up there, you won't get 3 meters from the base of it before they stop you. She turned to look at him. Someone needs to open that runway. Torres, I've got the transmitter, she said. Give me 30 seconds before you start your climb. I'll go in from the east, which is the longer approach, but the one they'll be watching less, because it's the harder terrain, which means they'll have fewer resources on it. I make noise. They pull attention east. You and she go straight up the north face and you get to the tower. And then? Mace said. And then I find you when it's done. She said it with the clean simplicity of someone who had decided, and the decision was not available for reopening. Mace, I heard the same thing you heard, 98.7%. I have been sitting here for the last 3 hours thinking about what that means, and what I keep coming back to is that those 11 people deserved better than what happened to them. And this, she gestured at Zaravel. At the transmitter, at the dark desert, this is the best chance that what happened to them means something. That what happens to humanity from here on out is different from what was decided for us before anyone on Earth had drawn a breath. She put the transmitter in his hand. That's worth the East approach. Torres, Mace said. What you're describing is. I know what I'm describing, she said. I also know what I'm not describing. I'm not describing dying. I'm describing creating a problem on the east side and then finding you. Those are two different things. She looked at him. The look had the quality of someone saying something clearly enough that it is also a reminder to himself, a fixing of a moment in memory. You've got 2 jobs right now. Get her out and get the truth out. She reached out and hit the side of his arm once, the specific 2-knuckle tap of her particular style of nonverbal communication. I've got 1 job. Don't get killed before I'm done doing it. Zaravel had been watching this without speaking. She spoke now. Sergeant Torres. Torres looked at her. They already decided we were worth killing, Zaravel said, in English, with the precision of someone quoting. The sentiment is correct. I want you to know that. She held Torres's gaze for a moment. And I want you to find us, Plan 2, Torres said. They started moving at second dark. Torres went east. She went without looking back, which was the right way to do it, and the desert swallowed her inside 90 seconds, and Mace watched the place where she'd been for exactly 3 more seconds and then turned north. Zaravel kept pace beside him. She was running on reserve now. The water had helped, but not enough, and the body has a ledger, and the ledger on 16 hours in extreme heat is not settled by half an emergency packet. But she was there, and she was walking fast, and she did not waste any breath she didn't need to. They walked in silence for a while. The desert at night was a different thing from the desert in the day, colder, quieter, the 2 suns replaced by a spread of stars that were different from Earth's stars, more densely packed toward what Mace thought of as southeast, where the galactic core was closer. He didn't know the constellations here. He didn't know the names of the stars. Tell me the rest, he said. Everything, all of it. And so, for the next 3 hours, walking north across the dark desert toward a thing that might not work, Zaravel told him everything she had found in the encrypted section of the Covenant archives. The full account of the stellar cataclysm 200,000 years ago. The survey data the architects had gathered when they found both populations. The deliberate nature of the uplifting process applied to Population A, the Cathari, which had been constructed to appear like natural development, but was in fact a managed acceleration program, maintained across 4,000 years of subtle intervention, resource placement, disease suppression, guided catastrophe avoidance. The formal decision record of the Architect Founding Council.
Signed by 17 beings whose names were recorded, but whose descendants were Seltun's predecessors in an unbroken line of succession.
The language of the decision was bureaucratic, careful, and utterly explicit. Population B poses a long-term competitive risk to the coherence of the proposed sovereignty structure. Reclassification and quarantine is recommended pending developmental trajectory monitoring. Population B is hereby designated Category 7, Subclass Suppressed Comparative, with indefinite review cycle. Suppressed comparative, not primitive, not dangerous. Suppressed because they were comparative, because they were proof of an alternative, because they existed. Mace walked north and listened to the history of his species being read to him out of someone else's perfect memory. And what he felt was not what he would have predicted if you had asked him in advance what he would feel. It was not rage. It was not grief, though those were both present in the way static is present on a frequency. What it was primarily was something closer to clarity. How long have you known, he said, that it was us? Since I ran the genetic concordance, Zaravel said, 40 days ago. Why did you keep the advocacy going? You could have stopped, left it alone. No, she said simply. I couldn't. She was quiet for a moment. When I understood what I had found, and what it meant that the Sovereignty Council had scheduled your diplomatic party for termination, had already decided the Category 7 quarantine would be enforced by extermination rather than expulsion, because extermination is cleaner. I understood that the advocacy was no longer about legal precedent. It was about the fact that what was being done was wrong. She stopped. Started again. I am a Covenant scholar. I spent 11 years in those archives. The foundation of every piece of law I have ever studied turned out to be a document forged by people who decided that one branch of their own family was expendable. She looked at him as she walked. I could not leave that alone. Even knowing what would happen to you. Even knowing. She kept walking. Does that seem unreasonable to you? He thought about sitting down in the sand next to someone he didn't know. No, he said. That seems exactly right. At the 24-kilometer mark, Torres's signal the implant-to-implant short-range channel they'd established before they split went dark. Mace stopped walking, stood for 3 seconds. Started walking. Mace, Zarbel said. Keep moving, he said. She kept moving. She didn't say anything else, and he was grateful for that, because what he needed right now was the walking in the north direction, and the transmitter in his pocket, and the 4 kilometers between them and the high point, and gratitude and grief were both things he could feel later. The high point was a mesa formation, rising about 300 meters above the desert floor at its north face. The relay tower sat on the summit. He could see the signal light blinking at the top, red and steady, the way infrastructure looked when it was working and didn't know anyone was coming. At the base of the north face, he stopped and looked up. 3 minutes, Zaravel said. 3 minutes, he confirmed. Then they climbed. The north face was 300 meters of sandstone in the dark, and it was not a technical climb. Footholds were wide and rough, the rock competent, the angle manageable, but it was 300 meters, and they climbed it with the urgency of people who were aware at every step that the people looking for had a vehicle road on the south side, and would be at the summit, either before them or not long after. Zaravel climbed without complaint and without conversation, which he understood as a decision about how to allocate what remained. Her breathing was hard by the halfway point and harder still by 2/3, but it stayed regular and she didn't stop. He stayed close below her, close enough that if she slipped he had a chance of catching something, and tried not to think about the math on Torres's signal going dark. The math on Torres's signal going dark was not a problem he could solve right now, and so he put it in the same place he put everything that would break him if he looked at it directly, and climbed. The summit arrived the way summits always arrive, too suddenly, after too long, the angle flattening out without ceremony. He came over the edge and pulled Zaravel up after him, and they both stood for a moment, breathing hard in the cold summit air. And then he looked west. Seltun was there. 3 vehicles, positioned at the top of the south road access in a loose perimeter. 12 guards in field armor rather than ceremonial dress, which was different from what they'd had in the desert, and meant someone had been planning for a different scenario than a ceremony. The relay tower was between Seltun's position and theirs 80 meters of distance, the tower sitting at the center of the summit plateau, its signal light blinking red and steady and indifferent. Seltun stood in front of the vehicles. He had changed his robing. He wore something darker now, less formal, and it suited him better. The ceremonial clothing had been a kind of performance, and the performance was over. He looked at Mace and Zaravel across the 80 meters of plateau with eyes that had the particular quality of eyes that have been doing math for several hours and are not satisfied with the results. Velnareth Zaravel, he said, loud enough to carry. His voice on the summit, in the cold and the dark, had a different quality than in the desert, stripped of everything except what it actually was, which was the voice of someone who had been holding a particular shape for a very long time and was tired of it. You have no useful path forward from this position. Zaravel stepped up beside Mace. She was still breathing hard from the climb, but when she spoke, the precision was back. I disagree. The relay tower requires a sovereignty access code to initiate galactic broadcast. You are no longer a credentialed sovereignty official. Your access has been revoked. Selthun took 2 steps forward, unhurried. Your human companion's emergency transmitter may reach an Earth relay if he is at sufficient elevation. He is at sufficient elevation. But the human relay network within range of this world has been under a sovereignty communication block for the past 6 hours, placed on my authority as senior member of the founding council. He stopped. Whatever he transmits will not reach Earth. Whatever you broadcast will not reach galactic open frequency. This ends here. The 12 guards had not moved. They were well positioned, and they were not moving because they did not need to yet. And people who do not move when they do not need to are generally the more dangerous kind. Mace looked at the relay tower. He looked at Selthun. He looked at the tower again. Then he said to Zaravel very quietly, "What's the access protocol if you identify yourself as a member of the founding royal house rather than as a Covenant scholar?" She was quiet for 1 second. The tower would default to the charter-level emergency broadcast function. Royal House emergency access cannot be revoked by Founding Council authority. It requires a 3/4 vote of the full sovereignty membership. She paused. Selthan does not have that vote. Can you access the emergency broadcast function? Yes. My genetic signature is sufficient. Does he know that? She thought for a moment. Possibly not. The charter-level access override is in a section of sovereignty law that predates Selthun's tenure. It was designed for a situation that the founders assumed would never arise: a founding council member acting against a member of the founding royal house. A pause. It is not a widely discussed provision. Mace looked across the 80 meters at Selthun. He thinks the access revocation stopped you. It appears so. So he's waiting for us to figure out we have no options. Yes. How long does the emergency broadcast access take to initiate? 45 seconds from genetic contact with the access panel. And then 3 minutes of protected broadcast time. Yes. The communication block, can it block an emergency broadcast on charter-level frequency? She thought. No. Emergency broadcast operates on a separate transmission architecture. It was designed specifically to function through interference. She looked at the tower. If I reach the access panel, the block is irrelevant. Mace looked at 12 guards between them and the tower. He looked at the transmitter in his pocket. He thought about the specific architecture of what Selthun had done and what he hadn't done, and the shape of the gap between those two things. He blocked the human relay, Mace said. But the emergency broadcast transmits simultaneously on all galactic registered frequencies. Yes, Zaravel said slowly, including the frequency my transmitter is tuned to. She looked at him.
If I initiate the emergency broadcast, your signal goes out on every frequency simultaneously, Mace said.
Including Earth Emergency Channel.
My transmitter receives it and rebroadcasts it on the Earth relay network.
He paused. The block he put on the human relay only stops transmissions originating from this location. A rebroadcast of a charter-level emergency signal is classified as relay traffic, not original transmission. Zaravel was quiet for a moment. Then she said, with the precision of someone who has just checked a very complex calculation and found it correct, he didn't think of that.
He's never had to think about the intersection of charter-level sovereignty emergency systems and Earth military relay architecture, Mace said.
Because those two things
have never been in the same place at the same time before.
Across the plateau, Selthun called out again. We can discuss what comes next. There are options available to both of you. I'm going to need you to run, Mace said to Zaravel. I know, she said. On my mark. Yes. The guards will move as soon as you step toward the tower. I will be between them and you. I need you to reach the access panel and initiate before they reach me. Understood. How fast can you run right now? She looked at him. Fast enough, she said, which was exactly the right answer, and he believed it, because she had been the right answer every time it had counted tonight. Selthun, Mace said, loud enough to carry. I have a question. A pause. Selthun was deciding what category of thing this was. State your question. The Covenant Archives encrypted section. The founding biological records. The architect intervention. He watched Selthun's face across the 80 meters and in the cold dark on the summit. You read them too, didn't you? The full text. The silence on the summit had a specific texture. The guards had not moved. The signal going to blinked. I'm not asking you to discuss it, Mace said. I'm asking you a yes or no question. Did you read them? Selthun was quiet for 3 seconds. Then he said, yes. So you know that what was done was wrong. What was done, Selthun said, and his voice had the particular quality of something held under significant pressure for a very long time, was done to protect a civilization that has functioned stably for 80,000 years. One decision, made by founders who had the full picture, produced 8,000 years of peace, scientific advancement, and galactic cooperation on a scale that has no parallel in recorded history. His voice did not waver. I understand that from your perspective, and from hers, the decision appears as a wrong. From where I stand, it appears as the most consequential correct decision ever made. He stopped. I am not protecting a lie. I am protecting 80,000 years of what that lie made possible. You're protecting it by killing her, Mace said. I am protecting it by ensuring the decision made 80,000 years ago remains effective. Selthun's voice had the quality of a man speaking something he has said to himself many times in private, and found sufficient. What was done to your species was regrettable. What would happen to this civilization if what was done becomes known is by any objective measure worse? I have done the math. Yeah, Mace said. I figured you had. And he nodded at Zaravel, and she ran. The guards moved. They moved well and fast, and with the coordination of a unit that had worked together, and they covered ground quickly. But Mace was already moving to intersect, and the angle between them and the tower was one that required them to go through him. And Mace had stopped calculating what was survivable about 3 decisions ago, and had been running on something else since then. He hit the first guard at the shoulder, and took them down into a redirected fall, which was not a thing you could do if you were carrying it out against someone significantly heavier than you, but was a thing you could do if you understood how to use someone's momentum against their center of gravity, which was a thing Mace had been trained to understand by people who did it for a living. The second guard pulled up to go around him, which changed the angle to the tower by about 15 degrees. He tracked that and moved to close it. Behind him he heard Zaravel's footsteps stop. Then contact, then initiating. The relay tower lit up. Not visually, the external appearance of the tower didn't change, but the signal light switched from red to blue, and a tone came from the access panel that carried a frequency Mace recognized, even without a translation implant, as a system-level confirmation. The emergency broadcast function had activated. 45 seconds of initiation. Then 3 minutes. The remaining 10 guards had a choice: continue moving toward Mace, or redirect toward Zaravel. At the tower, they split. 4 continued at Mace. 6 went for the tower. The 6 going for the tower slowed down. It was not a dramatic slowing, not a halt, not a reversal. But the pace changed, and Mace understood why even without looking. The broadcast function, once active, surrounded the tower with a charter-level active use field. Guards could reach the access panel, but any sovereignty-registered weapon would deactivate within the field boundary. It was a safety measure designed by people who understood that emergency broadcasts sometimes needed to happen in hostile conditions. Selthun knew this. Selthun was already speaking loudly, and what he was saying was, physical restraint only. Restraint only. Do not discharge. And the 6 guards approaching Zaravel at the tower were doing so with clear hands and the intent of physical interruption. But they had 6 meters still to cover, and the 45-second initiation had 30 seconds left. Mace dealt with the 4 in front of him by the simplest available method, which was to stop cooperating entirely with the concept of standing up. On the ground, with the polymer restraints still on his wrists, he was not winning any tactical assessments, but he was in the space between the 4 guards in the tower, and the 4 guards could not be in 2 places at once. The tower tone changed. Galactic emergency broadcast active, said a voice from the access panel, automated clear, in Kethari standard. Charter Article 7. Royal House Emergency Provision. Broadcast originator, Velnarath Zaravel. Second of the Kethari Royal House. Broadcast duration, 3 minutes. Broadcast on all registered galactic frequencies. Galactic records sealed at broadcast initiation. Suspension of security action required by Charter Protocol for broadcast duration. The 6 guards stopped. They stopped completely. 3 meters from Zaravel, hands clear, and they stopped. Because the automated announcement had just said the thing that Charter Protocol required to be heard and obeyed, and these were not beings who had decided to do something wrong. They were beings who had been following an order that had just hit a wall older than the order was. Zaravel's voice came from the access panel speaker, amplified across the galactic broadcast. What follows is the full text of the encrypted section of the Covenant archives. Founding period, biological classification records, Architect Council decision record, dated in Sovereignty Year 0, concerning the classification and disposition of 2 human populations. She read. Mace got upright. One of the 4 guards still had a hand on his arm, and he let it stay there, because it wasn't going anywhere and the arm wasn't needed for what he was doing. He pulled the emergency transmitter from his pocket with his free hand. The charter-level emergency broadcast was transmitting on every registered galactic frequency simultaneously, including the Earth emergency channel. His transmitter received the broadcast. He set it to relay. The communication block Selthun had placed on Earth relays was designed to block original transmissions from this location. This was a relay of a charter-level broadcast. The block did not apply. He pressed transmit. Selthan was walking toward the tower, not running, walking with the specific pace of someone who has done the calculation and understands that there is no version of running that changes what is already happening, and who has, under the circumstances, chosen dignity over speed. He reached the edge of the active use field boundary and stopped, and stood there, and listened to Zaravel's voice, reading the words that the Architect Founding Council had written 80,000 years ago, and then encrypted and buried in the certainty that no one would ever find them. She read for 2 minutes and 6 seconds every word, every name, every justification, and every number and every calculated decision made in a room on a world that had not yet decided to call itself the Sovereignty, by 17 beings who had decided that one branch of a family tree was expendable. At 2 minutes and 7 seconds, she stopped. That constitutes the full text of the founding document, she said. My name is Zaravel Velnanorath. I am the Covenant scholar who found this record, and I am the last remaining copy of it, and it is now in the galactic record and in the relay network of the human species, and that is where it will remain. At 2 minutes and 9 seconds, the 3 minutes ended. The guards moved. Mace didn't resist. There was nothing to resist against now. He let them take the transmitter. It had already done what it needed to do. He let them put the restraints back on, which were redundant since the original ones were still on. He let them walk him to where Selthan was standing at the edge of the active use field. Zaravel was walked out of the field boundary and brought to stand beside him. She had cuts on both knees from the climb, and her scales had a dusty, heat-worn look, and her eyes were the same as they had been for the entire time he'd known her, which was approximately 26 hours, which felt like a different unit of time entirely. Selthan looked at both of them. The broadcast is in the galactic record, he said. He was not looking at Zaravel. He was looking at Mace, with the expression of someone examining a result that their model did not predict and trying to understand the input they missed. Your Earth relay received the transmission. Yes, Mace said. You understand what you have done. We do, Zaravel said. Selthan was quiet for a moment. His eyes moved to her, and something crossed his face that was complicated enough that his implant gave up on classifying it. Not anger, not relief. Something older and heavier than either of those. The Sovereignty Council will convene within 48 hours, he said. The legal implications of a charter-level public record disclosure are there is no precedent for what happens next. He paused. Everything that was built on what you broadcast is now in question. Yes, Zaravel said. It is. I have spent my career protecting what was built. I know, she said. I believe that you believed it was worth protecting. I believe that you believed the math. She met his gaze steadily. I also believe the math was wrong. Not because 80,000 years of civilization has no value, but because the thing underneath it that was falsified, the thing underneath all of it, cannot be corrected by pretending it isn't there. A structure built on a falsified foundation doesn't become stable because the structure is old. She paused. It only becomes more expensive to fix. Seltun looked at her for a long moment. Then he said to the guards, secure them. Standard holding. Do not harm them. He paused. They are, as of this moment, Sovereignty public record witnesses. They are to be treated accordingly. The guards secured them. Mace found himself sitting on the cold summit rock with his hands in front of him, back against a guard vehicle, and Zaravel was placed beside him. And then the guards took positions that were technically containment, but were not, in any way Mace could identify, threatening. Selthun walked to the south edge of the summit and looked at the desert below, and Mace watched him stand there and couldn't decide what he was watching. A man considering what 48 hours looked like. A man accounting for something. A man who had done a math that had just been shown to be incomplete. Mace looked at Zaravel. She was looking at the sky. The stars were still dense and different and unrecognizable, and both suns were still below the horizon. But one horizon, the eastern one, had lightened to the deep amber that was the color of early morning on Kareth Sol, the color that came before anything else. He had the emergency transmitter back in his possession for the moment, because the guards securing them had not asked for it, and he had not offered it. And it sat in his pocket with the relay function still live and the signal confirming what it had sent. He thought about Torres. He thought about the 47-second window between the guard rotation that she had observed and used. He thought about what she'd said. I'm not describing dying. I'm describing creating a problem on the east side and then finding you. He let himself hold that without looking away from it. Zaravel spoke. What happens now? Her voice was quiet. Not fearful she was. He was beginning to understand, not much given to fear in the conventional sense. But it was a genuine question. She had done the thing she had come to this planet to do, had done it in a way that made everything different, and now here they were on a cold summit, at the beginning of a morning that was going to unfold in a direction nobody had charted, and the question of what happened next was real. Earth gets what I sent, Mace said. Galactic Record gets what you broadcast. The Sovereignty Council convenes and tries to figure out what a galaxy looks like when the Foundation document turns out to be a fabrication. He looked at the lightening horizon. People on Earth will decide what to do with that. People here will decide what to do with it. It's going to take a long time, and it's not going to be without cost. He paused. But the truth is out. That part is done. She was quiet for a moment. It cost Torres. Yeah, he breathed. It did. And the 11 people from your mission. Yeah. He kept his eyes on the horizon, all of them. She said nothing for a moment. Then carefully, what made you sit down in the beginning? You didn't know any of this. You didn't know who I was. You didn't know what they were executing me for. You didn't know it would matter. She turned to look at him. You sat down. He thought about a dilemma assessment. 4138-44. Instrument malfunction. He thought about a person on a battlefield who had been alive when he turned away, who had not been alive when the mission completed, and the way that specific fact had accumulated over 3 years into something that had become the weight he lived at, that he carried without looking at, that had made him sit down in the sand next to a stranger, because sitting down was the only thing he had control of. I already did the other thing, he said. The leaving. I already know what that costs. He looked at the horizon, where the amber was getting lighter. Sitting down cost less. She looked at him. He looked at her. The morning was coming, and it was going to be complicated and long and probably very difficult, and the things that had been set in motion tonight were not things that would be resolved in any span of time either of them would fully see the end of. The execution detail, Mace said it would take 40 hours. Zaravel's eyes found his. They were, in the lightning morning, the exact color of the Karath Sol sky at the best moment of the day, not the amber of the heat, not the coal red of noon, but this moment, the threshold moment, when the light was something you could still look at, and it was not yet asking anything of you. I figured I'd stick around, he said, and find out. A sound on the eastern edge of the summit. A guard's head turned. Then another. Mace turned, because something in the quality of the sound, careful movement over rough terrain, faster than comfort, by someone who knew how to be quiet, but was moving fast enough that quiet was a secondary concern, was specific. Torres came over the summit's eastern edge at a low sprint, bleeding from one arm and favoring the opposite leg, and stopped about 5 meters away from the guard perimeter and put her hands where visible, and looked at the guards and said, in Cathari that was limited but grammatically adequate, I am unarmed. I am stopping. I am surrendering to sovereignty authority. The guards looked at each other, looked at Selton, who was still standing at the south edge. Selton turned and looked at Torres, then at Mace, then back at Torres. Secure her, he said, standard holding. Torres walked to where Mace and Zaravel were sitting, let herself be searched, nothing to find, and sat down on the rock between them. She was breathing hard. She looked at Mace. Problem on the east side, she said. Created, resolved, reporting in. Mace looked at her. Both jobs done, Torres said. Both jobs done, he said. Torres put her head back against the vehicle and looked at the sky. Good, she said. Then I'm going to sit here for a minute. Zaravel looked at Torres, then at Mace, with the expression he had been watching for 26 hours, that was always at the boundary of something he almost had a name for, and that finally, in the cold morning on the summit, crossed it. She smiled. It was a human smile, not analogous to one, not similar to one, the same one, but the exact same architecture of expression that humans have used for 200,000 years when something that was breaking has been held together long enough to matter. 98.7%. Not convergent, not coincidental, the same. Overhead on the eastern horizon, the first sun cleared the rim of the world, and then 40.3 hours after it had gone down, the second sun rose. Dawn second. Both horizons lit simultaneously. The amber light of Karath Sol flooding the summit from east and west at once, pouring over the sandstone and the guards and the relay tower, with its signal light now switched back to red, steady and indifferent, and 3 humans and 1 princess who were the same thing and had never been told so, sitting in the early warmth of a morning that was going to be different from the one before it, in ways nobody had fully mapped yet. The judgment, by every tradition of the galactic sovereignty, was complete.